Some people lived lives so loud that even silence couldn't follow their exit. Freddie Mercury, David Bowie, Kurt Cobain, Jimi Hendrix, Prince, and John Lennon. Each one walked into a room and changed how the room felt about itself. And when they left the planet, they took a piece of all of us with them. The stories of how they got there and the stories of how they left are the kinds of stories that have people still arguing, still crying, still playing those records on repeat decades later. So let's talk about rock stars who we all love. A boy born on an island off the coast of East Africa ends up being voted the greatest rock legend of all time, beating Elvis Presley, and then dies at 45 in a London townhouse, confirming his illness to the world only 24 hours before his heart stops. A poll carried out among rock fans saw Freddie Mercury named the greatest rock legend of all time, beating Elvis Presley to claim the title, and ahead of David Bowie, John Bon Jovi, Jimi Hendrix, and Ozzy Osbourne. That is the arc of Freddie Mercury's life, and it starts in a place most people would never guess. Freddie Mercury, born Farrokh Bulsara on 5th September 1946 in Zanzibar, achieved global fame as the lead vocalist and pianist of the rock band Queen. His father, Bomi Bulsara, worked for the British government, which afforded the family a more privileged lifestyle than most others in Zanzibar. But privilege on that island was a relative concept. The son of Bomi and Jair Bulsara, Freddie spent the bulk of his childhood in India, where he attended St. Peter's boarding school. He was sent there at the age of 8, a world away from his parents, dropped into the rigid hierarchy of an English-style boarding school on the Indian subcontinent. He began taking piano lessons at the age of 7. Those early piano lessons would plant the seed, but nobody at St. Peter's was placing bets on the quiet boy becoming the frontman of one of the greatest rock bands in history. The violent Zanzibar Revolution of 1964, during which thousands were slaughtered, sent the Bulsaras running for their lives to England, where relatives took them in. The family landed in Middlesex, suburban Grey, unremarkable. For a young man who had been shuffled between Zanzibar, India, and now England, the sense of displacement was immense. Arriving in Britain in 1964, he had to operate in a world in which both his ethnicity and sexuality marked him out as alien. But Freddie enrolled at Ealing College of Art to study graphic design, and it was here that his universe tilted. Mercury then attended the Ealing College of Art and became enamored with the musical stylings of Jimi Hendrix. He befriended the members of the band Smile, and sometimes hung out at the band's rehearsals. Smile featured 2 students named Brian May and Roger Taylor. When Smile's lead singer departed, Freddie stepped in. He became friends with guitarist Brian May and drummer Roger Taylor of the band Smile. And in 1970, when Smile's lead singer quit, Bulsara replaced him. He soon changed the group's name to Queen and his own to Freddie Mercury. Bassist John Deacon joined the following year. Queen's early days were a grind, incorporating elements of both heavy metal and glam rock. The band debuted on record with Queen in 1973, which was followed by Queen II in 1974. Despite an impressive blend of majestic vocal harmonies and layered virtuosic guitar work, Queen initially failed to attract much notice beyond the United Kingdom. They were 4 university-educated musicians trying to compete in a landscape dominated by the raw swagger of bands like the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin. Nobody was asking for a band that sounded like opera had collided with hard rock. Nobody, that is, except Freddie. Then came 1975. The operatically styled single Bohemian Rhapsody was released in 1975 and proceeded to the top of the UK charts for 9 weeks. A song that was nearly never released due to its length and unusual style, but which Freddie insisted would be played, became the instantly recognizable hit. The record company thought a 6-minute operatic suite had no business being a single. Radio programmers were bewildered. Freddie did not care. He bulldozed past every gatekeeper, and the result is one of the most recognizable pieces of music ever committed to tape. Queen released Mercury-penned anthems that would go on to become classic rock standards, including Killer Queen, Somebody to Love, We Are the Champions, and Don't Stop Me Now. But the moment that cemented Freddie Mercury as a figure who transcended genre and generation was July 13, 1985, Live Aid, Wembley Stadium. The band's legendary set at Live Aid in 1985 was only 6 songs, but Mercury stole the show in front of a TV audience of nearly 2 billion people. In roughly 20 minutes, Freddie did something that no other performer on that bill, and the bill included David Bowie Elton John, Paul McCartney, The Who, and U2 could match. He held 72,000 people in the palm of his hand. The call and response segments, the vocal runs, the pure physical command of a football stadium, it wasn't performance, it was domination. Regarded as one of the greatest singers in the history of rock music, he is known for his flamboyant stage persona and 4-octave vocal range. That voice could do anything. It could sell you a ballad that would make you cry at your kitchen table. And it could power an anthem that 100,000 people could scream in unison at a sporting event. And the man behind it kept the most important detail of his life hidden, always private about his sexuality and personal relationships. Freddie never came out during his lifetime, wishing to be remembered for his music alone. He chose not to announce his HIV diagnosis. He spent the final months of his life as a recluse, nursed by close friends. On November 23, 1991, he admitted in a statement that he had AIDS and died the next day, aged 45. The world had 24 hours to process the admission before he was gone. As the first major rock star to die of AIDS-related complications, Mercury's death represented an important event in the history of the disease. His bandmates channeled their grief into action. In April 1992, the remaining members of Queen founded the Mercury Phoenix Trust and organized the Freddie Mercury Tribute Concert for AIDS awareness, which took place on 20th April 1992. The Mercury Phoenix Trust has since raised millions of pounds for various AIDS charities. Decades later, the 2018 biographical film, Bohemian Rhapsody, rejuvenated interest in his story for an entirely new generation. The biographical film Bohemian Rhapsody, released in 2018, rejuvenated interest in his story for a new generation, painting a vivid tapestry of his life, struggles, and unparalleled achievements. Kids who were born 15 years after his death started wearing Queen t-shirts. His songs reappeared on streaming charts. There will likely never be another Freddie Mercury, but the music he left us with is already enough to ensure his name lives on for centuries. If Freddie Mercury's story is about a boy who refused to let the world define him, then David Bowie's story is about a man who refused to let himself be defined at all. Not by a genre, not by a look, not by a decade, and not even by death. David Robert Jones, born 8th January 1947, known as David Bowie, was an English singer, songwriter, and actor. Regarded as among the most influential musicians of the 20th century, Bowie received particular acclaim for his work in the 1970s. His career was marked by reinvention and visual presentation, and his music and stagecraft have had a significant impact on popular music. But before all of that, he was just a kid from Brixton. Even his name was a reinvention. Born David Jones, he changed it to avoid confusion with Davy Jones of the Monkees. He grew up in London's working-class Brixton neighborhood. His mother was a waitress. His father worked for a children's charity. He started performing as a mime and cabaret entertainer in the late 1960s, evolving into a Bob Dylan-style singer-songwriter. He was trying on identities the way other people try on jackets. Some fit, some didn't, and most got discarded within months. Bowie studied art, music, and design before embarking on a music career in 1962. He released a string of unsuccessful singles with local bands and a self-titled solo album in 1967, before achieving his first top 5 entry on the UK singles chart with Space Oddity in 1969. The timing of that single was almost impossible to believe. The song earned him a contract with Mercury Records, who issued Space Oddity as a single on 11 July 1969, 5 days ahead of the Apollo 11 launch. A song about an astronaut drifting helplessly into space. Released the same week, humans actually walked on the moon. It was haunting, melancholic, and perfectly timed. But the single was a one-off hit. The follow-up album didn't sell. It was his first and last hit for 3 years. 3 years of silence after that kind of debut would destroy most careers. For Bowie, it was a chrysalis. He emerged in 1972 as something the world had never encountered. After a period of experimentation, he re-emerged in 1972 during the glam rock era, with the alter ego Ziggy Stardust. The single Starman and its album The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars won him widespread popularity. Ziggy Stardust was not just a character, it was a declaration of war on every assumption about what a rock star was supposed to look like, sound like, and be. The hair was flame orange, the outfits were skin tight and alien. The performance on Top of the Pops left millions of teenagers across Britain sitting in stunned silence in their living rooms, creating the space alien rocker persona he dubbed Ziggy Stardust, and developing a visually striking, loosely narrative stage show. Bowie became a megastar. By July 1973, he had 5 albums in the British Top 40, 3 of them in the Top 15, before abruptly killing off the Ziggy character in a farewell concert. He killed his most successful creation at the height of its popularity. That's who Bowie was. He didn't cling to what worked, he incinerated it and moved on. What followed in the next decade was a stretch of artistic output that few musicians in history have matched. Bowie's world-conquering phase came in the 1970s when he released brilliant album after brilliant with the assurance of a man who knew that he had been touched with genius. From The Man Who Sold the World in 1970 to Scary Monsters in 1980, you would struggle to find a poor release. He collaborated with Brian Eno. He moved to Berlin. He stripped his sound down to cold skeletal electronics, then rebuilt it into warm soul, then twisted it again into something nobody could categorize. He wasn't just a musician, he was a social provocateur. He announced his bisexuality in the mid-1970s, long before such a declaration was widely tolerated. Having dived deep into black music on such R&B-drenched hits as Fame and Young Americans, he was a strong advocate for African-American artists. He gave Luther Vandross his start as a recording artist, and tapped Nile Rodgers to produce 1983's Let's Dance. Perhaps most significantly, Bowie called out MTV during the network's early years for not playing videos by black artists. It is especially important to highlight how Bowie's presence in the music industry helped a generation of LGBTQ artists find their own voice in their music. Many expressed that his free-spirited essence gave them permission to be themselves. Then came the quiet years. He retired from music for the best part of a decade after an onstage heart attack in 2004, only to return in glory with 2013's The Next Day, an album recorded in complete secrecy and only revealed to the world on his birthday, Jan 8. Nobody saw it coming. One morning, the world woke up and Bowie had a new album out. No press tour, no singles, no leaks, just the music. And then, the final act. David Bowie passed away from liver cancer. It was revealed after his death that Bowie had been privately battling the disease for 18 months before his passing. His illness was kept largely out of the public eye, with Bowie continuing to work on his music and public projects during his final months. His death in 2016 came 2 days after the release of his final studio album, Black Star. His only record to top the US Billboard 200, he turned his own death into art. 4.3 million tweets were posted about Bowie within 24 hours of his death. Fans came together in Dublin, Berlin, New York, and Brixton to talk about Bowie, share their grief, sing his songs, and dress like him in his many guises. Music producer Nile Rodgers called him the Picasso of rock and roll. Since his arrival at the dawn of the 1970s, every new movement that followed, punk, new wave, hip-hop, electronic, goth, grunge, industrial, bore his stamp in some way. While age caught up with his peers, making them look old and irrelevant, Bowie's cool never faded. His impact only kept expanding. If Bowie built personas and lived inside them, then Kurt Cobain's entire existence was a rejection of the persona that the world tried to force onto him. He didn't ask to be the voice of Generation X. He didn't ask to be a rock star at all. And when the machine of fame swallowed him whole, he couldn't find the exit. Kurt Cobain was born in Aberdeen, Washington, and was a handful as a child, especially after his parents divorced when he was 7. He was a poor student, but was strongly drawn to artistic pursuits. Aberdeen was a logging town, rough, blue-collar, remote. There was no music scene, there was no art scene. There was work, and there was everything else. Cobain didn't fit the first category, and nobody in Aberdeen knew what to make of him. Cobain and bassist Chris Novoselic formed Nirvana in the late 1980s, and after recording a demo, the band landed a deal with an independent label. Following the modest success, Cobain hired Dave Grohl as the band's permanent drummer. They recorded Nevermind and became rock gods. That trajectory from a demo tape recorded in a garage to selling 30 million records worldwide happened in what felt like the blink of an eye. For people old enough to remember the arrival of Nevermind in 1991, Nirvana changed the music world forever. For those too young to remember, songs like Smells Like Teen Spirit and Lithium are still considered classics. The album didn't just top charts, it demolished the entire infrastructure of what mainstream rock was supposed to sound like. Overnight, the polished, big-budget arena rock of the 1980s became a relic. The hair bands scrambled. The record labels panicked. And at the center of the earthquake sat a scrawny kid from Aberdeen who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, wearing a thrift store cardigan and staring at the floor during interviews. While most bands on these lists have had long careers ranging from 7 to 40 years, Nirvana's recorded output lasted for only just a few years in the early 1990s. However, the impact Nirvana had on rock music echoed the same impact the Beatles and Elvis Presley had during the early part of their careers. Think about that comparison. The Beatles had years of touring, studio evolution, and cultural saturation to build their mythology. Cobain did it in roughly 3 years of mainstream exposure, but the fame that came with it was corrosive. Cobain struggled with chronic stomach pain that had plagued him since childhood, and the heroin he used to self-medicate became its own monster. He married Courtney Love, and they had a daughter, Frances Bean, but the tabloid coverage was relentless and invasive. After battling addictions and mental and physical illness, he committed suicide in Seattle, leaving behind a daughter and a musical legacy. He was 27 years old. Nirvana's run ended with the 1994 suicide of voice of a generation Kurt Cobain, but their music lives on, and so does the love. The love for what Cobain created has never diminished. If anything, it has swelled. Every generation of teenagers since 1994 has discovered Nirvana and felt that same jolt of recognition. The feeling that someone somewhere understood exactly how they felt about a world that didn't seem to have a place for them. If you asked 100 musicians to describe Prince in one word, you would get 100 different words. Genius, enigma, virtuoso, bizarre, revolutionary, stubborn, fearless, and every single word would be correct. The prolific multi-instrumentalist Prince Rogers Nelson was born to musicians in Minneapolis, a city he never really left. As a child, he discovered Jimi Hendrix and James Brown and landed a record deal while still in his teens. He wrote and recorded incessantly, often making every sound on his records. That last detail needs emphasis. When you listen to a Prince album, you are frequently listening to one person. One human being played every guitar, every bass, every keyboard, every drum, sang every vocal, and then produced and mixed the entire thing. The breadth of his musicianship was almost absurd in its scope. The commercial success of the semi-autobiographical film Purple Rain made him a household name. He confounded fans for his entire life by following his musical passions wherever they led, rather than trying to recreate old hits. Purple Rain sold over 25 million copies and produced some of the most iconic songs of the 1980s. But Prince was never content to repeat himself. The moment the world decided he was a pop star, he made a psychedelic record. When they called him a funk artist, he released an orchestral ballad. When they said he was washed up, he played a guitar solo at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that left every musician on stage staring at him in disbelief. It probably won't come as a surprise to you that Prince might not exactly fit perfect into the rock star or classic rock prototype, but any attempt to describe Prince's talent or music will always, inadvertently, fall comedically short. He was a walking contradiction. A tiny man with a colossal sound, a devout Jehovah's Witness who wrote the most provocative music of his generation, a control freak who could improvise like a jazz musician having a spiritual experience on stage. His battles with the music industry became the stuff of legend. He changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol. He wrote slave on his face during public appearances to protest his contract with Warner Bros. He pulled his entire catalog from streaming services years before anyone else was having that conversation. He was in every way ahead of the curve, and he didn't particularly care if the curve ever caught up. An accidental medication overdose killed the star in 2016, a terrible loss to the world. He was 57 years old. When the news broke, the world responded with a collective exhale of disbelief. Landmarks around the globe were lit in purple. Social media became a rolling eulogy. Musicians from every genre, pop, rock, R&B, hip-hop, country, all claimed Prince as their own, because he genuinely belonged to all of them. If rock and roll has a founding document, it was probably written in the feedback and distortion of a left-handed Fender Stratocaster played upside down, by a man from Seattle who rewired the instrument to bend sounds that no one had ever heard before. Jimi Hendrix paved a way. Hendrix opened the doors to not only experimental guitar techniques, but was a driving force behind the overhaul of rock music from the beginning of the 60s to the end of the decade. He didn't just play the guitar differently, he made the guitar do things it was never designed to do. Feedback wasn't noise, it was texture. Distortion wasn't error, it was vocabulary. The whammy bar wasn't a gimmick, it was a paintbrush. Born in Seattle in 1942, James Marshall Hendrix had a childhood marked by poverty and instability. His parents' marriage was turbulent, and he was often shuttled between relatives. He taught himself to play guitar on a cheap acoustic, mimicking the blues records he heard on the radio. He served in the U.S. Army, specifically in the 101st Airborne Division, before being discharged and pursuing music full-time. He spent years as a sideman backing artists like Little Richard and the Isley Brothers, learning the craft from the inside out. But the American music industry didn't know what to do with him. It took a trip to England at the urging of Chas Chandler, bassist of The Animals, for Hendrix to find an audience willing to hear what he was doing. Within months of landing in London, he was the talk of the music world. Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Pete Townshend, the reigning guitar gods of British rock, watched him play and openly questioned whether they should even bother picking up their instruments again. His debut album, Are You Experienced?, released in 1967, didn't just enter the conversation about guitar music. It detonated the conversation and started a new one. His performance at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967, where he set his guitar on fire, became one of the defining images of the 1960s counterculture. His performance at Woodstock in 1969, where he played a distorted, howling rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner, became one of the most discussed musical performances of the 20th century. His solo of the hit song Voodoo Child was released as a single just shortly after Hendrix's death, and thus shot to #1 on the charts in the UK. He died on September 18, 1970, in London, at the age of 27. The official cause was asphyxiation due to choking on his own vomit after ingesting barbiturates. He left behind 3 studio albums, a mountain of unreleased recordings, and a legacy that every electric guitarist since has had to reckon with. Guitarists today still study his techniques. He is a true legend. There is a building on the Upper West Side of Manhattan called the Dakota. It is a fortress of old money elegance with iron gates and arched windows overlooking Central Park. Few musicians have influenced the world like John Lennon. As a Beatle, he revolutionized music. As a solo artist, he preached peace and love. John Lennon's story is inseparable from the Beatles, and the Beatles' story is, by any statistical or critical measure, the most consequential story in the history of popular music. The Beatles, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and George Harrison, were head and shoulders above everyone else. The Beatles performed strongly in every category, from album sales, to chart success, to critical acclaim. I have personally stated many times that I felt the Beatles were overrated, but the statistics show that I am clearly wrong. The Beatles are indisputably the best rock and pop music act ever. Lennon was the sharp edge. McCartney brought melody and optimism. Lennon brought wit, skepticism, and an almost combative honesty. He was the one who said the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, a remark that triggered album burnings across the American South and demonstrated that Lennon had a talent for detonating cultural conversations with a single sentence. When critics, sales charts, and biographies were surveyed, it became clear that the Beatles were massively beloved and extraordinarily influential. The vast majority of rock and roll biographies somewhere credit the Beatles with inspiring them or getting them into music. After the Beatles disbanded in 1970, Lennon embarked on a solo career that was just as polarizing and just as magnetic as his time in the band. Songs like Imagine, Working Class Hero, and Instant Karma were not just music, they were philosophical positions. Lennon used the platform that the Beatles had built to advocate for peace during the Vietnam War, staging bed-ins with Yoko Ono that drew global media coverage. The FBI kept a file on him. The Nixon administration tried to have him deported. He didn't flinch. He stepped away from music for 5 years in the late 1970s to raise his son, Sean, returning in 1980 with the album Double Fantasy. The album was a meditation on domesticity, aging, and love, a mature, reflective work from a man who seemed to have finally found equilibrium. 3 weeks after its release, Chapman fired 5 shots outside the Dakota. 4 of them hit Lennon in the back. He was pronounced dead on arrival at Roosevelt Hospital. He was 40 years old. The global response was instantaneous and devastating. Vigils formed in Central Park. Radio stations around the world played nothing but Beatles and Lennon songs for days. It was one of the first mass media mourning events. a collective grief that presaged the way the world would later react to the deaths of Princess Diana and Michael Jackson. Lennon's murder changed something fundamental about the relationship between celebrities and the public. Security became a topic of conversation. The idea that a musician could be assassinated for being a musician entered the cultural consciousness and never left. But his music, the songs about peace, about love, about imagining a better world, has outlived the violence. It has outlived the controversy. It has outlived the man himself by more than 4 decades and shows no sign of fading. So what is it about these 6 people that makes us say we all loved them? It's not because they were perfect. Freddie Mercury hid his illness until the final hours of his life. David Bowie had a cocaine-fueled dark period in the 1970s that he barely survived. Kurt Cobain's relationship with fame was so destructive that it ended in the worst way imaginable. Prince could be impossible to work with. Hendrix's life was cut short by the same recklessness that defined his era. Lennon's sharp tongue wounded people close to him. We loved them because they were honest, not in the confessional social media way that people are honest today, but in the way that their music communicated something that words alone could never carry. It's tough to define exactly what a rock star is, but at their essence, they are really talented celebrities who are just cooler than everyone else. That's a simple way to put it. But coolness fades. What doesn't fade is the feeling you get when Bohemian Rhapsody builds from its quiet opening to its operatic middle section. What doesn't fade is the chill that runs through you when Bowie's voice cracks on Heroes. What doesn't fade is the raw ache of Cobain screaming through All Apologies, or Prince peeling off a solo that sounds like it's being transmitted from another dimension, or Hendrix bending a note so far that it sounds like the guitar is crying, or Lennon singing Imagine with a simplicity that somehow contains the entire human condition. Some artists have made timeless music that is still on repeat decades later. These 6 are at the top of that list, and the reason we keep going back to them is not nostalgia. It's not because we're stuck in the past, it's because the music they made is so fundamentally connected to what it means to feel something. To feel alive, to feel lost, to feel furious, to feel hopeful, that it renews itself with every listen. It's quite clear the halcyon days of rock are well behind us, but as long as people can access and enjoy the music, it will never truly die. These rock stars, the ones we all loved, they're not gone. They're just playing somewhere we can't see. And as long as someone somewhere presses play, they'll keep right on going.